So welcome to the Global Landscapes Forum, Africa, and welcome to Nairobi for those of you who are coming here for the first time. So this particular session really is going to look at the challenges that we've faced across the continent, in particular due to a degradation within our respective landscapes where we work or where we've had extensive work that we've done, but looking at the implications of these high levels of degradation and also just explore the possibilities of seeing how different development agendas contribute to actually making sure that the ecosystems that we plan to restore are restored within the context of climate change, sustainable development goals, and also looking at the Aichi targets under the Convention on Biological Diversity, because biodiversity certainly matters for these ecosystems. So, how are we going to do this? Due to the time limitations, obviously we have to be done by 10:30 out of this tent. We are obviously going to have two main objectives, which is exploring how we can promote the uptake and upscaling of ecosystem restoration in our respective work, but also how do we highlight the linkages between sustainable development goals, the Convention on Biological Diversity work on the Aichi targets, and in particular ecosystem restoration, African Union, the Agenda 2063, we look at the UNCCD, the Convention on Combating Desertification, but also looking at different other elements, Sendai framework, because disasters happen in some of these ecosystems we work. How do we bring all of that and provide linkages to all of that? So without further ado, I'd just like to introduce my panel members for this morning. Starting from the very end, we have Levis Kavaji, who also works with the UN Environment here in Nairobi in our Africa office. He is the sub-program coordinator for the Healthy Ecosystem sub-program. And next to him is Lisa Jajinsky, coming from the Convention on Biological Diversity and the program coordinator for this particular sector. And right after him is Elvis Tanjem, coming from the African Union. So I'd like to invite Levis to make a short intervention in how we're going to have this, this particular session. We are going to have some interventions from the panel members to really talk about their work. Levis is going to really address how what key messages have come out of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. I'm sure you're all familiar with IPBES. And these key messages, how do they align with the whole agenda that we're undertaking on ecosystem restoration? After Levis, we're going to have Mr. Tanjem coming from the African Union to now give us the political context. How do we, get this commitment at the highest level through the African Union to really commit to issues of ecosystem restoration? And then, lastly but not the least, we're going to hear from Lisa, who's going to now make the linkages with this global agenda. How does it all come together with these respective streams of conversation that are happening? Synergies with the Rio Conventions, synergies with the African Union 2063 agenda, etc. After which, depending on how many people come through, we may have some small groups, maybe a couple of groups because we're quite few, or we're just going to open it up for conversation and we're going to use Slido. And I shall explain to you what Slido is, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with Slido. Familiar with Slido? Great, I shall explain to you what Slido is. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Levis to just come and make a short intervention, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Msonda. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to make a presentation that is not prepared by myself, but has been prepared by the scientists who did the assessment on biodiversity at a global level, but also at a regional level in the context of Africa. We had a team that worked on preparing the assessments on what the status of biodiversity and the trends are. The purpose of this is to set the trends and understanding of the context of our discussion. But I want to start off by saying that it's not biodiversity for biodiversity's sake, but we're talking about ecosystems, biodiversity, ecosystem services, which are very important for human well-being. They underpin actually the socio-economic development, and for Africa, actually the Africa discourse on biodiversity and ecosystems is that African countries are seeing this as a natural capital that should be harnessed sustainably for the sustainable development of the continent. So let me start with the presentation. If I can have the, is this?
Yes, that works.
Okay. So Africa is rich in what you call natural assets, which are unique and in many places are only found in the region. Africa has an extraordinary rich biodiversity and ecosystems, and Africa is the last place on Earth with significant assemblage of large mammals. I was talking to some friends from the Nordics, and they were saying that they can drive for miles before they see a small animal. While here, you drive out of Nairobi, and you meet a lion, or a hippo, or a zebra. And if you go deeper, you start seeing a richer and richer range of biodiversity, both in plants and animal. But unfortunately, for many African governments, the true value of biodiversity, ecosystem goods, and services is not entrenched into the mainstream economic and decision making. And this is where we have a gap that needs to be addressed. Africa is also extraordinary in the biodiversity and ecosystem services in the sense of the traditional knowledge, the indigenous and traditional knowledge that we possess. I was at the youth conference for the GLF, and the first session there were speakers, youth speakers, and two of the youth speakers actually struck me because they talked about the rich inheritance of the Maasai community and how they relate with land and animals. And one of the presenters said that the way they conserve wildlife is not the same way that the wildlife authority conserves or sees conservation of wildlife. And this is based on hundreds and hundreds of years of indigenous knowledge on relating and coexisting with wildlife. But we can also talk about medicinal plants. We can also talk about just how healthy and prospering communities relate with the health and sustainability of their ecosystems and the range of biodiversity in the vicinity. This slide shows you, or attempts to show you, some of the values that you can place on different types of ecosystem services. When I talk about ecosystem services, I mean the benefits that we accrue from biodiversity for our own well-being. I will not go to the details, but it's a significant contribution to economies, and it's a significant contribution to human well-being, including what we don't normally value. The human capital is dependent on balanced and healthy food. Nutrition determines a lot how the human capital will be productive in future. In some countries, there are studies that show that if you don't feed children with balanced diets at an early age, their IQ will be affected. And if their IQ is affected, then the production capacity of that particular country will dip. And this is a phenomenon that happens for a very long time, because you have a generation of people who literally cannot maximize their potential because of what happened in the early age as they grew up. Their performance in school is an indicator, but even after performance in school, now the productivity at workplace is also a determinant. So we have a lot that we accrue from ecosystems and biodiversity, and we need to appreciate this at the continent level. But though we have this wide and rich range of biodiversity, unfortunately, they are under immense pressures. And therefore, there's need for action. And that's the purpose of our discussion this morning, that there's need for us to take action to avert the dooming horizon, what might become a disaster in the making. This chart shows you how in different subregions, there are 5 subregions according to this study, and they have looked at 2 types of ecosystems. And one is land, what we call terrestrial, the ecosystems that exist on land, including inland waters, and the coastal and marine areas, and what we can derive from that. And here you see the drivers of biodiversity change, whether they are positive or they're negative. The arrow pointing up means that you have a very high rate of change, degradation in the ecosystem. The arrow pointing slightly up but to a side means it's moderate. The arrow pointing horizontally means it's stagnant. The arrow pointing down, which I haven't seen from this chart, means that there is an increase. A decrease. So from this chart, visually, you can see that in virtually all the drivers of change, there's continued degradation of ecosystems and the biodiversity they are in. And notably, climate change and illegal trade in wildlife are drivers of this change. So whatever we do, we have to take action to avert a situation where we continue with this trend of loss. Here, in terms of land, some 20% of Africa's land surface, which is about 6.6 million square kilometers, is estimated to be degraded because of soil erosion, or salination, or pollution, or loss of vegetation, or soil fertility. Soil erosion, one of the major issues in Africa, actually is estimated to be the cause of the loss of up to 280 million tons of cereals per year. 280 million tons of cereals are lost because of poor soils that have been eroded of the nutrients. If we take business as usual, that means we don't take any action to avert degradation of our soils from a soil erosion point of view. It is estimated that up to 127 billion US dollars per year are lost because of this, which is about 12.3% of the GDP of 42 countries in Africa, which were in a particular study on the economics of land degradation. But if we take action, it's going to cost us $71.8 billion per year to restore or protect our soils. The difference between inaction and action is $62.4 billion per year. That means inaction will cost us more than taking action to avert the degradation of our soils. So when you talk about food security, one of the SDG goals, we may not attain food security if we do not address the issue of land degradation. This curve shows one of the future scenarios in Africa in terms of population growth and where they will inhabit. And Africa is said to be the second fastest growing continent where the population will be best in urban areas by 2050 after Asia. But when populations move to urban centers, there is an increase on the natural resources. The pressure on natural resources increases. And this, if not well managed, can cause further degradation of our ecosystems and loss to biodiversity. So from this graph, you can see actually where the line is around 2014, 2013. Up to 2050, the growth will be actually rapid. The rate of migration to urban centers and the rate of growth of populations of urban centers will be much higher than what has been taking place since the last 30 years. Africa is extremely vulnerable to impacts of climate change. It is estimated that by the year 2100, climate change could result in loss of more than half of the bird and mammal species, and 20 to 30% decline in the productivity of Africa's lakes and significant loss of African plant species due to climate change. And these are the realities that we are facing. And the climate change experts will tell you Africa contributes the least to greenhouse gas emissions. And also we will tell you good soils contribute to climate change by containing more carbon in the soils. We avert the amount of carbon dioxide that will be in the air. So there's interlinkages between climate change, land degradation, healthy and productive ecosystems, and the range of biodiversity. This slide shows you the proportion of species in each red list category as per each sub-region. The black means that there were species that existed in Africa, but they are now extinct. I'm not very good with colors, but the purple, the purple shows that the, what is that color?
It's red.
Red means that they're critically endangered species. So, what is the trend here? If you look at it visually, what do you get? You get a picture of black, red, orange, yellow, and these other colors in between. And it's not a healthy situation unless we take some action to address, to take measures that would reverse this negative trend in terms of species. Do we want to lose more species? Do we want our children to go to the zoo to be able to see what we are seeing currently in the wild? Do we want our lives to be endangered because, for example, the vulture is called the public health custodian. The vulture, as you may see it and underrate it, cleans up diseases from the environment. That is what the vulture's function is. But a vulture, if you don't take it from that perspective, you might find that it is even poisoned, as people think it's a nuisance. But it plays a very key role in our well-being, not only human, but also animal. To the extent that if the vulture was to be extinct, certain diseases that only affect animals would cross over to start affecting human beings. So species are indicators of the status of our well-being. I can say that. And this graph shows you, according to what we call the red list, it shows you a decline in species as per sub-region. Red list is a list that is maintained by the IUCN on the statuses of different species and whether they are endangered and what level of endanger they face. And you can see if no action is taken, then on the overall, we face a decline in species over the years. Can we achieve targets that were set for the conservation of biodiversity? In Africa, the answer is those targets will not be achieved unless transformational action is taken to avert the current trend. The Aichi targets, the 20 targets, I'm going through this very fast. The assessment shows that on most of these targets, Africa will not be able to achieve them by the year 2020. And the discussion is now, what should we do in the post-2020, and what is the level of ambition we need to raise for the post-2020, which Lisa will address shortly. But what are the options that we have in Africa? We can see that some measures which have been taken tend to increase or to hold the loss of biodiversity, to increase biodiversity or to hold the loss of biodiversity, especially in protected areas. This graph here shows you where measures have been taken, that there is hope, and actually we can achieve some of the targets. But for us to do that, we need to do what we call a scenario mapping and planning to see which trajectory will help us in future to achieve sustainability in our ecosystems and in the range of biodiversity. Species viability and things like that. We need to take the agenda that we have set, like Agenda 2063. Elvis and the African Union are the custodians of Agenda 2063, the Africa we want by 2063. The Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, and other agenda setting scenarios, and agenda platforms, and use a scenario matrix to see what is the development scenario that we can pursue in order to have a healthy planet in the future. And the different options that have been considered in the assessment are regional sustainability, where we say, what should our region do to become sustainable? Or local sustainability, that is forget about Africa as a whole. Let's talk about Kenya, or let's talk about Tanzania, or let's talk about our individual countries or our individual counties and provinces, and forget about what else is happening in the continent. Or say we take a policy reform perspective where we say all we need is policy. What we need to do is put together good policies, and these policies, enforce them. Once we enforce them, we will achieve sustainability. The other scenario is what we call the market forces. Allow the market forces to drive the development agenda and aspire to become as developed nations by trade and the demand and supply and pricing rules, marketing, advertisements, to get the consumer buying at any rate, so that we develop and achieve our, increase our standard of living. That is also another scenario. And the fifth scenario is what we call the fortress scenario. The fortress world is where you say, me, I have already developed, and I have to put measures to prevent anybody interfering with my development. At a continent level, maybe an example is to say the EU putting restrictions on how much Africa can export to the EU, or what goods and services can enter the EU, or the skills and the labor movement, migration of people between continents. But this, out of these 5 scenarios, what the assessment shows is that the only sustainable scenario is the regional scenario. It's followed by the national or local sustainability scenario. So if we take a regional approach and enhance it with a national approach, then we will be able to achieve a healthy and productive environment for now and for generations to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Levis, for that intervention. Welcome. For those who are just joining us, my name is Musonda Mumba, and I'm moderating this session. I'd like to just ask people if you can move a little bit forward, because we're actually filming this session, and it's going to be streamed. So, we've just listened to Levis Kavaji, who's coming from the Regional Office for Africa here at the UN Environment, talking about really the role of biodiversity and the changes and the interconnectivity with our very much our livelihoods and our well-being here across the African continent. At this juncture, I'd like to invite Mr. Elvis Tanjam, who's coming from the African Union, to really give us some context in terms of how is it that, you know, these policies, these frameworks around landscape restoration, and in particular, the Africa 2063 agenda contributes to the conversation of landscape restoration. Mr. Tanjam, please, over to you. Thank you.
Hello, good morning. Are we okay? Thank you for coming. The line was really long, and I had to behave very badly to be here. I had to just rush. So we are very happy to see you here this morning. I'm from the Africa Union Commission. How many people know Africa Union Commission here? Well, that's good. 50% of the hall. But what you should know is that, or what you don't know is that apparently almost every part of your life is controlled by the Africa Union. It's not very apparent, even for Africans, but actually that's what happens. So I would advise you to try to know it more and see how you can help it to help you control your life. Yeah, so we are talking this morning about some very, very sensitive topics. The issue of what I will put multilateral environmental agreements. All these agreements that we have agreed, both at the global level, at the continental level, even that influences our national policies. So that is what we're talking about. And here I will be focusing mostly on issues to do with land degradation and the effort at the level of the African Union to support global efforts, national governments in building resilience to climate change. And I'll be using an example which concerns me, which is the African Union Great Green Wall Initiative, which is what I do. I'm the coordinator of the Great Green Wall for the Sahara and Sahel Initiative at the African Union Commission. So we work, as Levis have been saying, we work within the framework of various multilateral environmental agreements. And I will name the few that were mentioned. We have the UN conventions, what I call the three sisters of the UN, UNCBD, UN CCD, and UNFCCC. Those are the main global environmental agreements. And then we also have the other ones like the Aichi, the Bond Challenge, and all what we have. In Africa, what governs our the framework that we work, that governs us, that was accepted or signed, endorsed, and agreed by our heads of state is the Agenda 2063, which is the indigenous African development strategy in the next 50 years, as my sister said. Within the framework of Agenda 2063, we have 7 aspirations. And within those aspirations, we have aspiration 1, which talks about the need for an inclusive, sustainable Africa. Very inclusive, with a focus on sustainability in our development paradigm. And when you go to Goal 7 of Agenda 2063, Aspiration 1, then you go now, it's very linked to SDG 15, and especially SDG 15.3, which talks about our life on land, talking about land degradation neutrality. And when you look at the other conventions, like the Abidjan Conventions on a marine ecosystem and also resilience and land degradation, you see that all of these policies are talking one thing: the need for sustainability in everything that we are doing. The need for us to be governed by the triple line, the need for social justice, sustainable development, economic based on sound environmental approaches. Or we can say now they talk about the need to reduce, reuse, and recycle. Go in all of these multilateral environmental agreements, and you will see that they are talking all about the same thing, and all can be linked. And when you go down to the national policies and strategies on environment, you can easily link in to the SDGs, to the Agenda 2063, to the 3 Rio Conventions, and to anything else. But why is it so difficult that these things are not done? Or let me put it in another way. Why aren't we doing what we are supposed to do? When I was flying here the other day, I watched a film, The Queen of Kitwe, the film about the chess champion. I think many of us have watched it, the Ugandan film. And there was a small story inside about a dog chasing a cat. And this guy said, look, the cat ran away. And when he asked the dog, why didn't you catch a small cat like that? He told him, look, I was just chasing a meal, but that cat was running for his life. Are we chasing meals, or are we running for our life? when we are dealing with the environment. And within the framework of the multilateral environmental agreements, there are challenges. And because I come from a policy body, I'm going to focus on one of the main challenges that we have, which is the interface between science, research, academia, projects, programs, and policies. Our lives are controlled by policymakers. In democracy, we vote them. We tell them to represent us. And then we turn around and say we don't like them. I'm putting it in a very layman's way of speaking. We turn around and say we don't like them. Oh, we don't like politicians. Oh, the policies they are making is rubbish. Oh, we don't want to work with national governments. Oh, we don't like regional economic communities. Oh, Africa Union is too big, it's too far. And that is where the problem lies. We sit at the Africa Union, we are part of, we are not from Mars. We are your brothers, we are your sisters. You people created the Africa Union. You wanted a union or a diplomatic and policy body that would talk on your behalf. We have the Africa Union, we have the Africa Union NEPAD, we have the COMESA, we have the SADC, we have all these political bodies that are supposed to be working for you. But when you look at the relationship between some of our main bodies that are supposed to work for us, talking about environmental issues, it becomes very difficult. The interface between, let me just put it, science, development programs, and the policymakers. Before going to the Africa Union, I worked for long in the development and in the private sector. And what took me there was to understand why policies don't work. Because we're very good at pointing fingers at politicians and policymakers. But I realized that most of the time it's us, development practitioners. We come into a country, we sit, we draw our project, we don't even talk to the district officers, we go straight, we are implementing, we don't talk to the traditional rulers, and then we want it to work. After 3 years, we pack our things and go. When we come back after the project has no existence, and we say, these people did not appreciate our development. But if we had gone into that country, go to the ministry, ask them what you are doing, how can we link up our project with the national priority, it will be great. So these are some of the challenges that we are facing. But at the level of the Africa Union, a lot is being done. I'm following up from what Levis presented, all the challenges that he showed. A lot is being done in terms of building resilience, in terms of biodiversity conservation, in terms of marine, in terms of disaster risk reduction, and in everything, the challenges that his slide showed. And we have various programs. We have like the Monitoring for Environment and Security in Africa. We have the Disaster Risk Reduction Program with the production of the African Regional Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is tied to the Sendai Framework, which is the global framework for disaster risk reduction. We have many other programs that are going on. But because I have very short time, I'm going to go straight into one of the programs that we are implementing, which is called the Great Green Wall for the Sahara and Sahel. I will ask our brother behind to quickly, why is it? Oh, how do I do it? Green? This? The center. Left, right, or? Where do you press it? Okay, it's going down. Forward. Yeah, so the Great Green Wall, quickly, is one of the main programs developed by the Africa Union Commission. If you know that building, you would have been in Addis Ababa or have watched a film about it. This is the Africa Union headquarters. This is 1/10 of the building, but this is the tallest one, the main office block and the conference center. And so we are talking about land degradation, and we describe in our development parlance land degradation as a very wicked problem. Wicked problem, why? Because it has no cure, there's no panacea. It's about change of the way we are doing things. And if you look critically on that slide, I can share it later on, you will see why it is defined as a wicked problem. And then we have the consequences of wicked problems. These are real images taken in the Sahel with everything that you can see about it. These are the consequences of the wicked problem. If you see the picture in the middle, it's not Photoshop, it's actual picture of migrants going towards the Mediterranean Sea. This was taken in Niger. These were migrants going towards Libya. And it's linked mostly, the UN environment recent statistics shows that most of the youths come from the driest part, areas most vulnerable to climate change and and the caprices of nature, which leads to complete destruction of their productive systems. And this is a map of a prediction from the World Bank on the future of environment. And so within the framework of the Africa Union Commission and all the other programs, we developed the Great Green Wall initiative. But it's good to show this one because apart from the problems, the dry areas of Africa are huge areas of opportunity. One of the biggest opportunity being that this region holds the youngest population in Africa. If you go to Niger, Burkina Faso, you see that the proportion of youth, of young people to the old people is higher than in most of the African countries. So these are huge areas of opportunity. You can see renewable energy and everything. So here we are looking at dryness. And I just want to give you a perspective into the Great Green Wall and what we are trying to do. If you look at the red area, that is the Sahara Desert, one of the biggest. We cannot invest too much there. We will deal with the oasis. And then look at the next area, you see that is the Sahel, or what we call the Circum-Sahara region, including the Horn of Africa. And then these are the regions, the next green area, those are the regions that we are working on within the framework of the Great Green Wall. And here we are talking about the areas that is rehabilitable, that can be restored. We're talking about 600 million hectares of land. And the red area is the hyper-arid region, which is the Sahara, and the other yellowish and less yellowish area, I'm also colorblind like Lewis, is the semi-arid regions. And what we want to do is to, oh no, how do I go back again? Is to look at the yellow-orange area. And this area makes up about 700, in the north, or in the Sahel region, it makes up about 778 million hectares of land. And then in the Southern Africa region, it makes up about 224 million hectares of land. And then the Great Green Wall is being implemented in all of these countries that you see the arrows going down. All of these countries. Those are the Great Green Wall targets. And now we are moving down south, because the government of the SADC region requested that they want an umbrella program that will bring together sustainable land management and restoration initiatives in their driest areas. And talking about restoration activities, this is the end. We are just looking at the various development or multilateral development strategies, Agenda 2063, the SDGs. And you can see that if you are following the Agenda 2063, which is a 50 years development plan, and the Agenda 2030, they give you clear indicators about what you need to do. For instance, if you are following up Agenda 2063 or Agenda 2030, you need to, and you want to reclaim 35%, or how many percent? 5% of the land, you need to reclaim or restore about 25 million hectares of land a year. But if you follow Agenda 2063, with the 5%, you will need to restore about 0.something million hectares. So these are statistics that we gather to show us, all of us here, the various challenges, but also the opportunities that exist in engaging in restoration activities, engaging in biodiversity conservation, engaging and following our multilateral environmental agreements. I would quickly stop here, and I hope we will have time to talk more about the various other initiatives and what we are doing within the framework of the Great Green Wall. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elvis. Welcome. For those who are joining us, it's really exciting to have you here. I'm just going to ask Lisa to present in the interest of time. To make her final presentation, Lisa is coming from the Convention on Biological Diversity, sitting within the Biodiversity and Climate Change program. Now, before Lisa comes over to the floor, I'd like to mention that we are going to be using Slido. For those of you who are familiar with Slido or not familiar with Slido, you can actually have the Slido app on your phone if you have a smartphone, or you just log in onto Slido, Slido.com. When you go onto Slido, the hashtag that you need to enter is hashtag GLF Nairobi. When you go to GLF Nairobi, it's going to give you several options. We are the CBD, hashtag, and it says CBD increased resilience. So we're going to be having some conversations on Slido, and they will be screened on the top. So you can decide to be anonymous, or you can actually tell us your name as you post these questions. So I'd like to invite Lisa. Over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Musonda. Thank you, panelists, Levis and Elvis. Oh, yes, you can't hear me that well, right? Thank you so much, Musonda. So I think we need to be able to hear from a lot of people in the room as well. So I will tell you just a short story of ecosystem restoration under the Convention on Biological Diversity. As Elvis mentioned, the CBD is a multilateral environmental agreement similar to the UNFCCC and the UNCCD. We work together for the conservation, the sustainable use, and the equitable sharing of benefits of biodiversity. The CBD, in case you don't know, if I could, who has heard of CBD already? I don't know how much I need to go into it. We just had our logo has slightly changed. It's 25 years now, so we're celebrating an anniversary this year. And we have 196 parties to the convention, near universal and near universal parties, and you can find out much more about all the thematic programs of work that we cover. I happen to work on biodiversity and climate change. Previously, I've worked on ecosystem restoration and protected areas, but there's many, many thematic programs of work under the CBD, all linking back to the conservation, sustainable use, and equitable sharing of benefits of biodiversity. So the story of ecosystem restoration goes back to 2010. We had our COP was in Japan that year, and we adopted the strategic plan for biodiversity, and the years that spanned was 2011 to 2020. So as you've heard, there is discussions ongoing now about a post-2020 agenda. This COP was quite important for the strategic plan and for 20 Aichi biodiversity targets that were adopted at this COP. 3 of which directly relate to ecosystem restoration in some way, avoiding degradation, restoring at least 15% of degraded ecosystems, and restoring ecosystem services, because most of all, while the biodiversity targets are about ecosystems, they're about ecosystem services and restoration and conservation. They're ultimately about providing services to people, including goods and benefits. And achieving these targets is not going to be done with just a one-off approach, just using nature or just using applied approaches, but certainly with a mosaic of approaches. So our next COP was in 2012, and on ecosystem restoration, a very comprehensive decision was for the first time adopted under the convention. Along with this, many heads of agencies, heads of the GEF, heads of IUCN, and many parties came together, COP presidencies came together to make a specific call for concerted action on ecosystem restoration. It's called the Hyderabad Call. So it was quite a good moment in time for ecosystem restoration, a bit of a rallying point. At our next COP, we're doing a tour of the logos of our previous COP, so you can see how nice they were and how colorful. Maybe Levis and Elvis, you're not appreciating the colors, but they're quite nice. So at COP12, the Forest Ecosystem Restoration Initiative was welcomed by the parties to the convention. This is an initiative that's supported by the Republic of Korea over this time span right from 2014 through 2020. They are continuing to contribute towards capacity building projects, output projects, articles, as well as workshops, and some direct funding to small scale, very small scale funding to small projects that might need other co-funding. So that's called the FERI, the Forest Ecosystem Restoration Initiative. Immediately after that, in 2015, these Sustainable Development Goals were adopted as well, and we like to visualize them as what we call a wedding cake of Sustainable Development Goals. So you can see them in a bit of perspective, where the biosphere is really the very foundation of these Sustainable Development Goals. If you're not addressing the biodiversity issues, the water issues, life on land, life on water, life in water, I should say, then the rest, the benefits to society, the benefits to economies, you're not going to be able to achieve those things. So the attention, the focus, a lot of the work really needs to be done right at the very basis. Oops, I think I missed one. So in 2016, we had our COP13, the lucky COP, in Cancun. At this COP, for ecosystem restoration specifically, because there was an extensive agenda, including on mainstreaming of biodiversity into sectors. But at this COP, a short-term plan on ecosystem restoration was adopted by all of the parties. This was actually an initiative of Africa. This was quite advocated for. This action plan was advocated for Africa, and all of the parties adopted it. Within the action plan, it has a stepwise process of undertaking ecosystem restoration. It has some principles and some tools, and it has as well a few key biodiversity considerations to be taken into account when undertaking ecosystem restoration. So a few examples of these we can think of are to be sure to try to use native species in your restoration efforts, try to avoid afforestation, putting trees perhaps where they historically have not been, as good practices for helping biodiversity, as well as helping to enhance the benefits to people. So within we can call it the STAPER, the Short-Term Action Plan on Ecosystem Restoration. It highlights that restoration really has a multidisciplinary focus, and that with informed planning, we can ensure that different interests, different needs are being addressed, and that viable approaches are being implemented. So for this COP, in addition to this document, an information document was produced by IUCN. You may be interested to look it up. It was on restoration of forest ecosystems and landscapes as a contribution to Aichi biodiversity targets. So this was linking commitments under the Bond Challenge and showing how they are contributing to parties' commitments that they've made under the Aichi biodiversity targets. So for the next COP, which is coming up, and it's in Africa. So it's a really special COP, I think, for Africa. Egypt is quite proud to be hosting the COP this year in November. You can look for some interesting supporting documents that will be coming out to help define ecosystem restoration within the implementation of forest and landscape restoration, or FLR, as well as a companion document to the short-term action plan. This will be worked on by the Society for Ecological Restoration with the CBD Secretariat and FAIRY, the Forest Ecosystem Restoration Initiative, and it will be adding on some more information to the short-term action plan with some case studies and examples for disseminating and increasing the uptake of this short-term action plan and the biodiversity components in it. So the message coming out of all these information documents and out of COP14 is that ecosystem restoration efforts can really improve adjacent lands and resources which are needed for protection and for production. It can improve land tenure, good governance, and in fact institutional capacity and governance. These are very key issues to make this happen, and it's not an easy way forward. These really need to be addressed in order to achieve the results on the ground. Especially when we're talking about trying to conserve healthy lands that are out there and they're at risk of conversion, because these lands are certainly delivering the benefits, but there's always conflicts with the socioeconomic aspects. So at this COP, which is COP14, the government of Egypt really wanted to support Africa to speak on biodiversity, and in particular on land degradation and ecosystem restoration. They wanted Africa to speak with really one voice and at a very high level. And so they proposed at an AMCEN meeting, the African Ministers meeting, that they would undertake a special ministers meeting before the CBD COP, before the high-level segment in November, to have a meeting, just a summit really, just for the ministers of Africa to speak about biodiversity, to take this moment to say, this is our commitment on biodiversity, this is what we can do on land degradation, ecosystem restoration, and how this contributes into the post-2020 process, because we're really almost there. We're halfway through 2018. So this is a bit of a track of what these small events towards a summit on ecosystem restoration and biodiversity. Upcoming in September is a special AMCEN meeting where the summit will be discussed. The summit itself will happen on the 13th of November. There's many, many inputs. It's not starting from scratch, of course. There's the commitments under AFR 100, the commitments under the Bond Challenge, the commitments that have been made within biodiversity plans that have been sent to the CBD Secretariat. We find commitments on ecosystem restoration under the NDCs. So certainly all this information and many, many others from all the partners involved, and it's quite extensive, I won't name them all these inputs will be feeding into the special session of AMCEN. Ministers will go and they will have these products available and be distilling important messages for the outcomes of the summit. And that, of course, won't be the end. I'm only putting a few CBD meetings here and meetings here that are linked to the summit, but there's so many other events that are happening as well, and I'm really not putting them all there, but not to think that it's just a one-off thing. We're certainly continuing the process and continuing the dialogue with everyone. And the following COP is important. We'll determine a new 2020 agenda going forward post-2020 for biodiversity, and that COP will be in China, of course. I don't have the logo yet, but I'm sure it'll be available soon. Okay, so I guess that's all. I would just mention that the outcomes of the summit are going to be a declaration that comes from the ministers. They will have their attention focused on this issue for a while. And there will also be an action agenda, which is perhaps the declaration is a short political commitment, and then the action agenda will have many more details in it. So we look for your inputs, we look for your comments, and I want to thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, it's working. Thank you so much for that presentation. I will not take time to really summarize in the interest of time because technically, we're supposed to be out of here by 10:30, so I might eat into your tea time a little bit. So I want to open it. I'm seeing some questions coming up. Thank you so much for those who are on Slido. If we can have the Slido, some of the Slido questions projected, please. We've got some very interesting questions. So I think really the fundamental question here, so how do we actually capitalize the governments, the so-called leaders, as Mr. Tanjum said, the one that, the people that we vote into these places, into authority to make decisions on our behalf. So how do we capitalize them in improving implementation on ecosystem restoration? I'm going to take up one question here. There's a question from Wario, and it says the global goals in restoration requires local attention. How can local knowledge be how can local knowledge be incorporated and incentives given for local communities to actively conserve? I think this is an open question to all the three of you. I'll take a few more questions. I think there are two questions here. There's Akinyi Chemtai who's asked, and there's someone else in Anonymous who has asked in relation to the CBD, the participation of communities and local youth within the CBD Convention, and also how much room is there for these communities to shape the discourse of the convention. And I think most of our countries, or at least the countries we're coming from, are represented within the CBD Convention. I'll take another question from Louis from Eco Agriculture. What will an action agenda seek to accomplish? So if we can start with those three questions. So there's the question of, from Wario, the global restoration, how can local communities be incentivized to participate? Maybe we can start with Levis.
Thank you. Thank you. The beginning point of restoration is at the local level. This we have to realize that there is nothing like restoration starting from a continental level. Every action, including the Great Green Wall, has action at the community level. Now, the incentive, I would like to put it in two perspectives. We must have an intrinsic incentive as a people to restore our lands, to restore our ecosystems, to protect and stop the loss of biodiversity. We must have an intrinsic value as a community, as a people. And secondly, the extrinsic, the incentive now coming from outside. So is land important to yourself as an individual? is an ecosystem important to yourself as an individual? What would your life be like if we did not have productive soils? These are the critical questions that should then motivate us at an individual and a community level to take action to protect our lands. Secondly, the extrinsic, the incentive coming from outside. Realizing that national growth, national economies are dependent on the units of production. Then, from a national resources, personally, I think that is the more sustainable. From national resources, we need to budget for sustainability of our land, of our ecosystems, and protection of biodiversity. Then, if we need help, help can come in to supplement, complement, to support what we have taken action to do. So basically, and I want us to have this change in thinking, the driver of change is ourselves. How do we value, how do we relate to our environment?
Thank you, Levi. So we are the change we want to see. Lisa, over to you in terms of engagement of communities at this high level, at the CBD level, please.
Thanks, Musonda. So yes, very much the indigenous peoples and local communities are very much involved in CBD processes. There are many, many decisions that are very inclusive decisions, and we should be really as Levis said, the action is really on the ground, and the uptake from the ground. If you should be so lucky to have indigenous peoples and local communities, because they really help forward the agenda on biodiversity and on conservation and conserving their own lands. They are contributing greatly to biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. And much of this knowledge is actually being lost. So it's really would be very fortunate to be able to make use and involve them right from the very beginning, in, especially in ecosystem restoration processes, which are to the benefit of the local communities, and they really need to show these benefits. But yes, of course, the youth and the indigenous communities are very much present at CBD meetings. I hope that helps answer the question.
Thank you so much. Tanjum, you actually did mention, there's a question there that looks at, I think from Wara, that says the global goals in restoration requires local action. And you did mention in your presentation about the role of local action at and also youth, especially within the Sahelian region of the Greenbelt movement. I beg your pardon, of the Green Wall, the Great Green Wall. Now, there's a question there that is saying, who is funding the Great Green Wall initiative? So I don't think we really got a sort of a sense of that. So if you can maybe articulate a little bit on that.
Yes, thank you very much. I think the Great Green Wall initiative, talking about the funding, first is funded by the African Union and the member states. That's the preamble. It was created by the African Union heads of state for the continent, the member states, to take the issues of land degradation, desertification, and resilience building seriously, and to inculcate them or to integrate them in their national economic development plans. So the funding, by default, is coming from the member states. But that said, a lot of the funding is coming from our international development partners. Our international development partners play a big role because issues of land degradation and desertification and climate change has no boundaries. What happens in Kenya has a lot of repercussion of what is going to happen in New York and vice versa. So we have international partners, the UN conventions, the World Bank, the German government, the UN environment where we are, and everybody that has a concern for land degradation, desertification, and sustainable development is involved. We have many partners that are involved in the program. We have the GEF, the Global Environment Fund, the World Bank, the FAO, European Union, that are chipping in on funding of the Great Green Wall. But in general, we encourage the the national governments to provide national funding for the Great Green Wall. And we are also going innovative, and we are engaging the blockchain funding, and we are working with, we are looking at the issues of blockchain and cryptocurrencies on how we can fund the Great Green Wall, and there's a lot of promises. We are working with an institution, M2E, to look on how we can use the blockchain system. I know there are many youths inside this hall that are very interested in blockchain, cryptocurrency, the famous one being the Bitcoin. But we are not using the Bitcoin, actually. But we are looking at the various systems provided by blockchains and cryptocurrency on how to finance these Great Green Wall activities, especially at the local level. Yeah.
Cryptocurrencies for restoration. Any thoughts on that from last words from the two panel members, please?
Well, actually, I wanted to speak just very quickly to the Great Green Wall. There's also a small support from the Forest Ecosystem Restoration Initiative to Burkina Faso and Niger, in particular on providing research to the Great Green Wall. There was another question on what will an action agenda accomplish, if I could just address that very briefly. So yeah, it would, actually it's not formed yet, it's in discussions. Let's have some inputs from you. What does it seek to accomplish? What can it possibly accomplish? What we can certainly envision is that it's not brand new. It would be bringing together with one voice, again, the actions, the commitments that are happening, especially on ecosystem restoration and combating land degradation. So that's what I could only say about that now. Did you have closing?
No, just to reemphasize what Lisa says, this is also your opportunity to contribute to this action agenda.
Great.
What should it look like? What should it focus on? I mean, the question actually should be a poll question from, who is it? Wario? Louis. Yes. Louis's question should be a poll question, actually. That how should this agenda look like? So let's as well see this as an opportunity to contribute to developing this action agenda.
Great, and please keep those questions coming. Keep those questions coming, because we're going to take all of this even after you've left this room. They're going to be consolidated and also be given as feedback in future. So we'll take one last question. If you can address the question that's addressed to you, Tanjam, in relation to the funding element. I think you've addressed a little bit of that, but if you can address just the
thank you, Zu from C4, talking about funding of governments and financing from the north. One thing you should know, the Great Green Wall is about building resilience, and it's about resilience also to climate change. And as you know, climate change, if you look at Africa and the percentage that Africa contributes to climate change is the lowest and even below. I don't think even the statistics that have been provided are right. Africa contributes less than 0.1% on all these things. When you look at what is happening in China, the US, and other countries. So the financing is coming from the north. That is true. And we are actually looking for more support from our northern international partners without any fear or favor, because we are building resilience and climate change has no boundary. But talking about African governments, up to today, African governments have put a lot. If you are a project person, you know that project is in cash and in kind. Most of the activities that are undertaken within the framework of the Great Green Wall are taken within the framework of various ministries in our countries. So a lot of the money, more than 50% of the money have come from our governments. And as we say, we are calling on everybody to come on board to support. And many people are supporting various activities, the Great Green Wall, FR 100, Evergreen Agriculture, and various restoration projects in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanjam. I think at this juncture, I'd like to ask the audience if they can give an applause for the panel members. And to yourselves for coming in so early. I just want to say, as a UN Environment staff member and also part of the planning committee for this meeting, really it is for your interest and security. The delays at the gate, I sincerely apologize. However, we have to make sure that anybody coming into this UN complex is securely checked, thoroughly checked, to come into this complex so that we don't compromise your security. Thank you so much for sticking around and listening to this session. Please keep those questions coming on Slido, and we're going to consolidate them. And Lisa and the team and the colleagues are going to provide input into the upcoming UN Biodiversity COP that's going to happen in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Thank you so much. So enjoy your coffee and enjoy this very beautiful campus, the UN Gigiri compound, and we'll see you soon. Thank you so much.